Make sure your insurance doesn't come up short. Get gap cover with ALA. For more information, follow the links in the description. Come and join me for a very special track day on March the 9th. Open to drivers of all experience levels. We'll use our usual low number format with just 21 spaces available to the public. Our events always focus heavily on the social side of things, with a dinner held the night before at a local hotel for everyone to get to know each other, and on this event we've got something very special planned. Westfield have agreed to bring along a pair of their cars for you to experience. They'll be doing passenger laps and driving sessions. Even better, they have very kindly agreed to do all of this at absolutely no extra cost to you. For more details, follow the link down below, and we hope to see you there.
Hello everybody, today I'm going to be sharing with you an often overlooked part of British motoring history. One of those cars that some of you may already be familiar with, and others may have seen out and about at the occasional show, or maybe, just maybe, on the road and gone, what on earth is that? Well, this is a Daimler SP250, better known to many as the Dart. And if history had gone Daimler's way, this could have been a great success. Instead, it turned out to be an enormous failure. But is this yet another case of British engineers and workers just being too lazy to do the job right? Or was there something else going on? And, more importantly, now, over 60 years since the Dart was launched, what's it like to drive? Well, find out in today's episode of JayEmm on Cars. Now, I didn't want to confess this to the owner, Steve, before I drove the car, but this is one of the rare examples of a car that I am genuinely nervous to drive. And it isn't because it has no seat belts, no airbag, no ABS, no traction stability control, crash safety, and is built on a chassis so wobbly when it first came out, apparently, sometimes in a corner, a door would just fly open. No, nothing of the sort. Instead, it is because this car has been in Steve's family from new. His Uncle Jack purchased it way back in 1960. Subsequently, not long after in fact, his great Uncle Jack bought it. And then in 2000, Steve acquired it, and his hope is that when he's done driving it, it'll then pass on to the next generation. And I absolutely love stories like that. But what about the car? Well, the Daimler Dart was part of a rejuvenation of the Daimler company which started in the mid to late 1950s. At the time, they were owned by the Birmingham Small Arms Company, a name you might know better as BSA. Their new boss, Mr. Ed Turner, was tasked with the creation of a new V8 engine designed to appeal to the ever-burgeoning American market, which had both more customers and more money than the domestic one, and both a saloon and a sports car to put it into. Come the end of the 1950s though, and the saloon was still some way off. However, the sports car was closer to production, and they worked out that with a few modifications to their plans, like building the thing out of fiberglass as opposed to metal, they could not just make it, but make it and make some money too. They installed in it a 2.5 litre version of their then new V8 engine. It was a relatively unusual affair, combining both old and new technology, so it's still cam in block with overhead valves. Inspiration in some part apparently being taken from the Cadillac V8, which itself could trace its roots back to the First World War. However, the team behind it had a lot of experience in the world of motorcycles, specifically Triumph, and so it apparently integrated some features from the world of two wheels. It was given this very distinctive body with, believe it or not, 2+2 seating. Apparently you can get people in the back there. If it was the 1950s, you were all small and you didn't care whether the kids had room or not. and they launched it to the world at the New York Auto Show in 1959, where it was unofficially crowned the ugliest car at the show. Poor old Daimler. Got worse too, because having announced it to the world as the Dart, Dodge then approached them and went, "We already make a car called that. You better come up with a different name." And so, officially, this was then known as the SP250. Somewhat uninspiring, really, isn't it? Today, everybody just calls it the Dart. And when it first launched, people loved the engine, which here makes 140 horsepower and 150 pounds-feet of torque. The rest of it, though, was not quite so good. The 4-speed gearbox, which has synchro mesh on 2nd, 3rd and 4th, is okay. The steering, though, a very big issue. It was of the recirculating ball variety, which other manufacturers used for decades afterwards, but it just wasn't very good. So this car and many others have been upgraded to a rack and pinion system taken from a Triumph. It is why it has this more 1970s style steering column as opposed to the 1950s one that it should have. This particular car also came with some very unusual options from the factory, and this was at a time when the factory options list was a phone number you could ring and tell people how you wanted your car to be built. So this one came in a shade of green a bit lighter than the classic British racing, this gorgeous interior which was later retrimmed, though in faithful colours, and I have to say I utterly adore. It's a kind of cinnabar orange almost. Love it. Perhaps the biggest issue the Dart faced, though, was its chassis, which was infamously flexible. So much so that, the story goes, in bends sometimes a door would simply pop open. Now there is a good chance that is simply urban legend, but even so, when Jaguar then acquired the company in 1960, they immediately set about improving that and a few other things. This car is a result of those improvements and is known now as the B-Spec. There was a later C-Spec, though the differences were nowhere near as dramatic. Other features specific to this car, it has the seats from the saloon, known as the Pullman. By default, this would have had far more racy, buckety style items. These are relatively comfortable, though they do take away from the already limited space in the cabin and give you little to nothing in terms of lateral support, meaning that in spite of the car's relatively limited cornering ability, the minute you do try and get around a bend, you find yourself sliding over into the passenger seat. At one point in time, Great Uncle Jack had also fitted the car with 225 wide tyres, though that made it almost impossible to manoeuvre at low speeds. Him being a part-time amateur wrestler, it wasn't a problem, but for Steve, it was. So it now sits on a set of 185 wides wrapped around superior correct wire wheels. Braking was always by discs all around, though naturally they are not spectacular, and if I do things right, I'm not going to have to put them to the test. To then round out the specification of this particular car, it was also fitted with mounting points for a set of fog lights and chrome caps for the heads, designed to help insulate the radio interference. We're not sure if they actually do anything. And here's the funny thing, you look back on a car like this and you are certain that there are reasons why maybe it didn't do brilliantly, but when you hear how few they sold, you can't help but be shocked. Allegedly, they shifted in the entirety of this car's production run, some 5 years or so, just over 2,500 of them. I mean, look, people just didn't buy that many cars back then. This would not have been a cheap car in its day, though for something with a V8, relatively good value. An E-Type, itself already considered a good buy, was some 50% more expensive when it landed in 1961. And of course, at that point, Jaguar also owned Daimler, meaning this car really was somewhat redundant. It probably also didn't help things that then a year later, in 1962, the MGB arrived. That then starting life with only 4-cylinder power, later gaining the V8, but being a much better developed and I think much better supported proposition. The Dart today is then kept going by a community of very enthusiastic fans, a combination of those who remember it when they were young and those who have come to know it and adore it for its left field styling and rather wonderful engine. And just how good is it? Well, let's find out. It might only have 140 horsepower, but it's still relatively torquey, and the car weighs less than a ton. So though it's not tear your face off fast, it's actually quite pleasant. It also makes a great noise. Not your typical American V8 rumble. That may be partly on account of the fact that here we have an as original exhaust which comprises two separate parts, one for each bank. The red line is at a pleasing 6,000, haven't got anywhere near there yet, and this I've been told is much more of a cruiser than it is a sports car. Bearing that in mind though, it is very pleasant indeed. Now, as is typical for cars of the day, visibility is mixed. Of course, I can see everything with the roof down, and the roof itself, by the way, not a particularly good fitting item. It might have warped over the years, but even so, it probably was never that brilliant. The wipers, I have been told, are a waste of time. The windows I have been warned not to use unless I am stationary, the door is open, and I can help them either up or down. And by his own admission, Steve says that if this were a car that he didn't have a family connection with, he wouldn't have it. But as he does, he quite enjoys it. Now, it's at times like this you're very grateful for the fact the car is tiny. Afternoon. Oh, lovely clean power. Builds nicely. Oh yeah, there's the speed limit. What a delight! Going the 50s, this would have felt proper. Kind of feels like your MX-5's mad, shouty great uncle that sometimes tells really off-colour jokes that belong in the 50s, but is all round quite a nice, well-meaning chap. Also got to give some credit to this gearbox. It's really quite delightful. Probably helps that it feels like the lever does go straight into the box, and other than the lack of synchro on first, it's very nice. The handling is somewhat wayward. Even with Jaguar's upgrades to the chassis, you can feel it's got a lot of flex in it. But if you're just pootling around, which is clearly this car's happy place, it's fine. A bigger concern is the fact that, for me with my famously long torso, visibility is somewhat restricted by the fact that this windscreen is precisely in the middle of my vision. I basically have to duck down to be able to see the road. Dear oh dear. Here we go. Oh, listen to that. What a glorious engine. And we're so lucky to have this weather. Coming to the end of the Great British Summer now, and I was worried that today was going to get rained off. For I'm driving not just this, but Stephen's other car. His real pride and joy, I think, is 1964 Jaguar E-Type. And I must admit, I am a little bit nervous about driving that too, because that is a car, unlike this, where everybody tells you it's the best thing ever. And I've driven an E-Type once, but in unusual circumstances. I enjoyed it. Whether I'll feel the same about it on my test route, oh, let's find out. But that's the thing, you know, cars like this, proper classics, it doesn't really matter that they're not that great in a bend. The steering here is okay, it weights up nicely, but the chassis runs out of talent very quickly indeed. And then, to be honest, even if it could grip, well, you fall out the seat. Oh, just delightful, absolutely delightful. I like this car a lot. Wasn't sure if I was going to be honest, but it's marvellous. Oh yes, even heel and toe in it. Well, that was more of a rev match, to be honest. Sorry to any nearby dogs. Now, though the Dart and also the Daimler Saloon were not to be long-lived after Jaguar acquired the company, the engine did see service in the Mark II. They also apparently tested it in the Mark X and found it to be even quicker in 4.5 litre guys than Jaguar's own 3.8. Though, truth be told, by the time Jaguar turned their engine into a 4.2, it was quicker once again. And from the off, Daimler never had much production capacity for the V8, meaning even if the car had been a success, they were always going to have a problem, because they just wouldn't have been able to build them fast enough. How very British. The good news, of course, is that because these cars never achieved the level of fame shared by the likes of the E-Type, you can pick them up for reasonable money. And today on Auto Trader and Car and Classic, they exist at anywhere from around £15,000 up to 50. And with a relatively good-sized boot, this would make an excellent car for summer days out, trips to the pub, taking to the occasional show. It's got a lot going for it. There we have it. That's a look at a little bit of British motoring history that I've really quite enjoyed. I want to say a big thank you to Steve for bringing it out, to his son Ben for driving the car today, and of course to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.